He was the Ice King, the man whose heartbeat regulated the city's pulse. Tonight, in a soundproof boardroom high above the neon lights, he was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, metallic tang of cold steel. Men who commanded armies of assassins were afraid to blink. In this room, breath was a luxury no one dared to waste. Then, the impossible happened. Amidst the sea of black suits and loaded weapons, a shadow moved. It wasn't an assassin. It wasn't a rival boss. It was a 6-year-old girl with dirt-smudged cheeks and a tattered drawing clutched in her hand. She bypassed guards who were trained to kill on sight. She didn't walk with fear, she walked with recognition. And when she reached the head of the table, she didn't scream. She reached out a small, trembling hand and tugged on a $3,000 cashmere sleeve. The room froze. No Hae-jin, a man carved from frozen stone, looked down into eyes that mirrored his own. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper that carried the weight of a thunderclap. 5 words that stopped a massacre and shattered a decade of silence. 5 words that proved the Ice King still had a heart to pierce. What did she say? And how did she find the man the world thought had no soul? The hotel was a palace of glass and secrets, a fortress where the laws of men didn't apply. To the tourists, it was a 5-star luxury, to the underworld, it was the throne of the No Empire. Hae-jin sat at the center of it all, a titan in a tailored suit, his gaze a death sentence for anyone who dared to fail him. He was the god of soul, and he had long ago burned every bridge to his past. And then there was Arden. She was a ghost from a fire everyone thought had gone cold. 6 years old, selectively mute, and wearing the remnants of a foster system that had tried to break her. In a world of blinding power and ruthless violence, she was the only thing that was real. She wasn't looking for a boss, she was looking for her father. She needed a miracle, and she had just walked into the arms of a monster. The air in the boardroom was thick with the metallic tang of expensive cologne and the unspoken scent of fear. Hae-jin sat at the head of the obsidian table, his posture deceptively relaxed, though his eyes remained sharp as a blade. Before him, a single tablet lay flat, its screen glowing with the countdown of the killing vote. Across the table, Park Sun-woo looked as though he had aged a decade in the last hour. His hands, usually steady enough to sign away billions, were trembling. The digital ticker above them showed the numbers climbing with a relentless, rhythmic pulse. The public was hungry today. "You've always been a proponent of democracy, Sun-woo," Hae-jin said, his voice a low, melodic contrast to the frantic ticking. "I thought you'd appreciate the purity of this process. No backroom deals. No legal loopholes. Just the collective will of the people you've spent your career exploiting." "Hae-jin, please," Sun-woo rasped, his eyes darting toward the other board members. They remained as silent as statues, their gazes fixed on anything but the doomed man. "We can settle this. Whatever the price is, I'll pay it. Double it." Hae-jin leaned forward, the light of the tablet reflecting in his dark pupils. "That's the beauty of the vote. It doesn't recognize currency. It only recognizes debt. And yours is quite substantial." The screen flickered. The execute percentage hit 49%. The room felt like a pressurized chamber, the silence so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a scream. Hae-jin watched the progress bar with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He wasn't fueled by rage, it was something far colder, a sense of inevitable equilibrium. The floorboards didn't just creak, they screamed. To Arden, every groan of the wood sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the Miller household. She didn't pack much, just a moth-eaten sweater, a jagged piece of a broken mirror she used to remember what she looked like, and the quiet, simmering rage that had become her only constant companion. She reached the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Mrs. Miller's snoring continued from the upstairs bedroom, a rhythmic, wet sound that Arden hoped she would never hear again. With a slow, agonizing twist of the knob, she stepped out into the biting chill of the November air. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had something to lose. The city was a different beast at 3 a.m. It was a labyrinth of neon ghosts and steam rising from the grates, smelling of old rain and desperation. Arden walked until her feet went numb, her thin sneakers offering no protection against the slush. She needed a place to disappear, a shadow deep enough to swallow a girl who didn't exist on any official map. That was when she saw the neon sign of the gilded cage flickering in a narrow alleyway. It wasn't a place for the faint of heart, but the heavy steel door was propped open by a crate, and the warmth bleeding out into the street was intoxicating. She slipped inside, thinking only of the heat. The hallway was lined with velvet that had seen better decades, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and something metallic. As she moved deeper, the muffled roar of a crowd grew louder, cheers, jeers, and the rhythmic thud crack of bone hitting bone. She realized too late that she wasn't in a shelter or a late-night diner. At the end of the hall, a man stood like a monolith. He was draped in a tailored suit that cost more than the miller's entire house, his eyes tracking her with the detached precision of a predator watching a stray kitten wander into its enclosure. "You're late for the cleaning shift," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. Arden froze, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. She could run back into the cold, or she could step into the light of the arena. She looked at the man, then at the blood-stained floor of the entryway. "I'm not here to clean," Arden whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. The man tilted his head, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Good. Because we're all out of mops, but we're always looking for fresh meat." She had escaped the cage, only to walk straight into the lion's den. The cold in the vault wasn't just the bite of the subterranean air, it was the clinical chill of men who dealt in lives as if they were currency. Kalen stood at the center of the ring, his breath hitching in a throat tight with the metallic tang of fear. Above him, the syndicate's heavyweights leaned into the dim light of the overhead lamps, their faces etched in scars and indifference. The deal was fracturing. Voices rose, sharp and jagged like broken glass, as hands drifted toward the holsters hidden beneath tailored silk jackets. One wrong syllable and the floor would be painted red. In the suffocating press of the tension, Arden moved. It was a small, almost domestic gesture that cut through the escalating violence. He reached out and caught the hem of the lead enforcer's heavy wool coat, a sharp tug that forced the massive man to stumble back a half-step. The movement was so unexpected, so devoid of traditional aggression, that the shouting died instantly. Every eye in the room pivoted toward the slight figure standing in the center of the storm. Arden didn't look at the guns. He didn't look at the stacks of illicit credits on the table. He looked directly into the eyes of the man holding their lives in his hands, and his voice, when it came, was a soft chime in a cathedral of silence. "Let the light come back." 5 words. They weren't a command, nor were they a plea. They were a simple statement of a reality Arden seemed to be seeing just beyond the grime of the vault. The silence that followed was heavy, but the quality of it had changed. The predatory hum of the room evaporated, replaced by a profound, ringing stillness that made the enforcers look at one another with a sudden, flickering uncertainty. It was as if Arden had reached into the chaotic machinery of their world and simply pulled the plug. The lead enforcer stared down at the small hand still resting on his coat, his fingers twitching away from his weapon. For the first time in an hour, the air felt breathable. Kalen felt the pressure in his chest ease, though his heart still hammered against his ribs. He watched as the hardness in the room began to dissolve, not out of mercy, but out of a shared, bewildered awe. Arden stood there, radiant and terrifyingly calm, having silenced the most dangerous men in the city with nothing more than a gentle hand and the quietest of truths. The underworld had no armor against peace this absolute. The heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open, yielding to the sleek black sedan as it wound up the private drive. Perched on the edge of the leather seat, Arden stared out the window at the towering walls of the mansion. It was a structure of sharp angles and obsidian glass, reflecting the gray sky like a polished mirror. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a monument to silence. Hae-jin cut the engine. The sudden absence of the car's hum felt heavy. He looked over at the boy, whose small fingers were white-knuckled around the straps of his backpack. For the first time in his life, Hae-jin felt the suffocating weight of a responsibility he couldn't delegate or automate. "We're here," Hae-jin said, his voice sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet cabin. He led Arden through the cavernous foyer. Their footsteps echoed against the marble floors, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to emphasize how empty the space truly was. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray shoes by the door, and no scent of cooking, only the sterile, cool fragrance of expensive air filtration. Hae-jin paused in the center of the living room, his hands sliding awkwardly into his pockets. He looked around his own home and realized, with a sharp pang of anxiety, that it was a minefield for a child. The glass coffee tables had lethal corners, the minimalist sculptures were fragile and worth millions, the fridge was likely stocked with nothing but alkaline water and bitter espresso pods. "This is where you'll stay," Hae-jin said, gesturing vaguely toward the upper floors. Arden looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. "Is it just you here?" "Yes," Hae-jin replied, the word feeling colder than usual. "Just me." He watched as Arden walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The boy looked tiny against the vast backdrop of the manicured, frozen gardens outside. Hae-jin felt a strange, frantic pulsing in his chest. He was a man who managed global portfolios and navigated hostile takeovers without breaking a sweat, yet he found himself paralyzed by the simple question of what a child ate for dinner or where they slept. He realized then that he hadn't just brought a boy into his house, he had brought a heartbeat into a tomb. The fortress of glass, designed to keep the world out, suddenly felt like a cage for both of them. Hae-jin took a tentative step toward the boy, then stopped, unsure if he was allowed to offer comfort or if he even knew how. The silence in the study was heavy, weighted with the sort of truth that reshapes a person's entire history. Hae-jin sat behind the mahogany desk, his fingers trembling as they traced the embossed seal of the laboratory. He didn't need to read the numbers again, the probability of paternity, 99.9%, glared back at him with the cold finality of fate. Arden stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the setting sun. She looked so much like him in that light, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same restless energy in her stance. For years, Hae-jin had mourned the true dragon, the older brother who had been the heart of their family and the rightful heir to everything Hae-jin now oversaw. His brother's death had been a hollow ache that never quite healed, a void that had left the dragon lineage feeling brittle and incomplete. "He never told me," Arden whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "He was just a man who raised me in the countryside. He was kind, and he was quiet. I never knew he was a dragon." Hae-jin stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away from her. Up close, the resemblance was even more piercing. It wasn't just physical, it was the way she held her grief, with a quiet dignity that his brother had possessed in abundance. "He left to protect you," Hae-jin said, his voice thick with an emotion he usually kept locked behind layers of corporate steel. The title of the true dragon was a crown of thorns. "He must have wanted a life for you that wasn't stained by the blood of our legacy." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before finally coming to rest there. The connection felt electric, a bridge spanning 2 decades of silence. Hae-jin had spent years searching for a piece of his brother to hold on to, never realizing that the man's greatest legacy was walking the earth, unaware of her own fire. Arden turned to face him, her eyes searching his for a sign of what came next. "What does this make me?" Hae-jin looked at her, the daughter of the man he had worshipped, the niece he never knew he had. The power vacuum in the family had just been filled, though the world didn't know it yet. "It makes you the blood of the dragon," he replied softly. "And it means you are no longer alone." The transition from a cold-blooded assassin's lair to a preschooler's playground happened in the small, absurd details. It began with the ribbons. Arden, blissfully unaware that the men guarding her bedroom door were capable of ending lives with their bare hands, had decided that their tactical vests were missing flair. One Tuesday, Min-ho, a man who had once cleared an entire warehouse of rivals without breaking a sweat, stood frozen in the hallway. Arden had managed to loop a neon-pink satin ribbon through his holster. The other guards stifled laughs until they saw the look on Hae-jin's face. He wasn't angry, he was fascinated. He watched from the doorway as Arden patted Min-ho's hand, telling him he looked very pretty for work. For the first time, the heavy, suffocating silence of the estate was broken by a sound so rare it felt like a fracture in glass, Hae-jin's soft, tentative chuckle. The montage of the following weeks was a study in contrasts. Black suits and pink lace. Heavy artillery and coloring books. The guards, who once communicated only in grunts and radio codes, found themselves recruited into tea parties held on million-dollar Persian rugs. They sat cross-legged, knees hitting their chins, sipping imaginary Earl Grey from plastic cups while their eyes scanned the perimeter for snipers. Hae-jin was the most profound transformation. He began to linger in the room she occupied, his rigid posture slowly softening. He learned that Arden's joy was infectious, a localized weather system that forced the clouds out of his own mind. One afternoon, while Arden struggled to draw a sun that didn't look like a jagged star, Hae-jin sat beside her. He took the yellow crayon, his fingers scarred and steady, and added a series of perfect, glowing arcs. Arden looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "You're an artist, Hae-jin." The corners of his mouth, usually set in a grim, straight line, twitched upward. It wasn't the practiced, predatory smirk he used in boardrooms. It was a genuine, lopsided smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the skin there for the very first time. He realized then that he wasn't just keeping her safe from the world, she was keeping him safe from himself. The Mafia guards noticed the change, too. The air in the house grew lighter, though the guns remained loaded. They were no longer just protecting an asset or a captive, they were guarding the only light they had seen in years. The great hall was a cavern of cold stone and colder hearts. The air tasted of ancient dust and the metallic tang of unspoken fear. Arden stood in the center of the mosaic floor, the eyes of the 12 elders boring into her from their elevated dais. They didn't look like leaders, they looked like statues carved from resentment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Elder Vane leaned forward. His voice didn't boom, it scraped against the silence like a whetstone. "The foundation of our society is built on the predictable flow of the hierarchy," he began, his fingers steepled. "Every soul has a place. Every power has a limit. But you, Arden, you are a variable we did not account for." Arden felt the heat rising in her palms, a restless energy that wanted to tear through her skin. She kept her chin high, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I haven't broken any laws," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Laws are for those who fit within the frame," a woman to Vane's left countered. Elder Mira's gaze was clinical, devoid of empathy. "Your very existence blurs the lines we have spent centuries drawing. If the people see that the hierarchy can be bypassed, that power can manifest outside of our bloodlines, the structure collapses. You aren't just a girl, Arden. You are a crack in the dam." The murmurs among the council were low, like the sound of a distant storm. They weren't debating her guilt, they were calculating the cost of her survival. To them, she was a mathematical error that needed to be corrected before it skewed the entire equation. Vane stood, his heavy robes rustling. The movement was a signal, and the guards at the periphery of the hall shifted, their hands moving to the hilts of their blades. "The verdict is unanimous," Vane declared, his eyes locking onto hers with a finality that chilled her blood. "Arden of the Lowlands, you are declared a fundamental threat to the stability of the realm. We cannot allow a spark to remain where there is so much tinder." He looked toward the captain of the guard, a man whose face was hidden behind a mask of polished steel. The command was spoken with the casual indifference one might use to order the clearing of a brush pile. She is to be dealt with immediately. See that no trace of her influence, or her breath, remains by dawn. The heavy iron doors behind Arden groaned shut, the sound echoing like a tomb closing. She was no longer a citizen, or even a prisoner. She was a threat to be extinguished. The lanterns flickering along the perimeter of the estate cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to bleed into the stone. It was a night of stagnant heat and uncharacteristic silence, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. Hae-jin stood by the koi pond, his back to the veranda, watching the dark water ripple. "The perimeter is secure, sir," Sang-hoon said, his voice as steady and familiar as a heartbeat. He had been at Hae-jin's side for a decade, the silent shadow that anticipated every move. Hae-jin nodded, not turning. "And Arden?" "Resting. The preparations for the transfer are complete." Something in the cadence of Sang-hoon's voice, a microscopic delay, made the hair on Hae-jin's neck rise. He turned slowly, but the world had already shifted. The guards who usually stood at the gate were gone, replaced by men in dark, tactical gear who moved with a predatory efficiency. "Sang-hoon?" Hae-jin asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Sang-hoon didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, he drew his weapon, the barrel leveled directly at Hae-jin's chest. "The board offered what you couldn't, Hae-jin. Longevity. A way out of the wreckage you're building." The air in the courtyard turned frigid. "You're selling your soul for a seat at a table that will crumble within the year," Hae-jin said, his eyes flashing with a mix of cold fury and a rare, sharp pang of grief. "I'm surviving," Sang-hoon countered. A muffled cry echoed from the upper balcony, slicing through the tension. Hae-jin's composure shattered. He lunged forward, but the sharp click of multiple safety catches being released stopped him dead. On the balcony above, two men emerged from the shadows, dragging a struggling Arden between them. Her eyes were wide with a terror that burned brighter than the crimson lanterns. "Hae-jin," she cried out, her voice breaking. "Let her go," Hae-jin commanded, his voice vibrating with a primal threat. He stepped toward the stairs, but Sang-hoon stepped into his path, the gun never wavering. "She is the only leverage that keeps you from burning everything down tonight," Sang-hoon said, his face a mask of professional indifference. "She goes with us. If you follow, if you even breathe toward a phone, she doesn't make it to the warehouse." Hae-jin watched, paralyzed by the weight of his own choices, as they forced Arden into the back of a black SUV. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl in the quiet night. As the taillights faded into the distance, leaving him alone in the red glow of the dying lanterns, Hae-jin realized the betrayal hadn't just cost him his empire, it had taken the only thing that made the empire worth having. The sirens were a distant wail, a frantic heartbeat against the silence of the top-floor suite. Hae-jin didn't look at the monitors anymore. He didn't need to see the stock prices plummeting or the board of directors calling for his head. For 20 years, this empire had been his skin, his armor, and his cage. He stood before the massive floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in his tired eyes. Behind him, Arden sat huddled on the leather sofa, her breathing finally steady. She looked so small against the backdrop of the corporate titan he had become, a titan who had almost sacrificed her safety for a quarterly earnings report. "It's done," Hae-jin said, his voice barely a whisper. Arden looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "You signed the divestment? But your legacy, the family name." "The name was a weight, Arden. Not a legacy." He turned away from the window, the glow of the burning bridges reflected in the sharp lines of his suit. To save her from the hostile takeover's fallout, he had triggered the scorched earth protocol. He had liquidated the holdings, exposed the corruption he had spent a lifetime hiding, and effectively erased his own power. By sunrise, he would be a man with nothing but a bank account and a reputation in tatters. He walked over and sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing her. For the first time in a decade, he didn't check his watch. The frantic energy that usually vibrated under his skin had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, hollow peace. "I spent my life building a throne so high I couldn't hear the people on the ground," he said, reaching out to tentatively take her hand. His fingers were steady. "I almost lost the only person who actually knows my name, just to keep a seat at a table of ghosts." Arden squeezed his hand back, a small, fragile gesture of forgiveness. "What happens now?" Jean looked around the room, the expensive art, the cold marble, the symbols of a man who had traded his soul for influence. It all looked like ash already. He felt a strange, light sensation in his chest, a breath that went deeper than any he'd taken since he was a boy. "Now," he said, a ghost of a real smile touching his lips, "we go home. Not to the penthouse. Just, home." He stood up, leaving his phone on the table. It was still vibrating with calls from the elite, the powerful, and the damned. He didn't look back. As they walked toward the elevator, Jean realized he wasn't losing his empire, he was finally escaping it.